Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's ACM Tech Talk. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and professional development, serving a global membership of nearly 100,000 computing professionals and students. My name is Juan de Hoya. I currently serve as a project officer for the AI for Good Global Summit at the International Telecommunications Union. That's the UN agency specializing in information and communication technologies. I'm also an active ACM member, and I serve in very different capacities through the organization, including roles in the ACM Practitioner Board, the ACM Professional Development Committee, and the ACM Future Computing Academy. This talk is obviously not about me, but if you want to learn more about my bio, you can check out the bio window on your screen. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the ACM and the benefit it provides, I'm here to provide a little bit more information about that. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members stay really competitive in the ever-changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources that we provide in learning.acm.org. So if you're very interested in learning what else we have to provide, please feel free to go there. We do have a lot of resources available. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in the global environment. So some of those examples could be our timely computing information published by the ACM, including communications of the ACM and Q magazines, access to the ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics. We do support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, as well as the ACM Touring and ACM Prize in Computing Awards, as well as our updated ACM Code of Ethics, which is a collection of principles and guidelines designed to help computing professionals make ethically responsible decisions in professional practice. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technology that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. And again, all these resources are available to you through our website. So before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown in the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find some additional widgets and resources for that. If you're experiencing problems with the slides or audio, we highly recommend you try out pressing the F5 key in Windows, Command+R if you're on a Mac, or refreshing your browser on a mobile device. Or you can close and relaunch your presentation at any time. It will still be available. To control the volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have any questions during the talk, we highly encourage you to type them in the Q&A box at any time and click the submit button. I'll be organizing the questions as Cristian talks, and he'll reserve time at the end of the presentation to address them. This session is being recorded and will be archived, so you will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available. Again, if you're interested in this talk and monitoring updates on it, as well as any of our upcoming talks in the Tech Talk program, please check out learning.acm.org. We got some really cool stuff coming up. I can't talk about them yet, but please stay tuned. At the end of the presentation, you will see a survey open on your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out to help us improve our Tech Talks. Our goal is ultimately to serve the community, and we really want to be able to learn from your feedback on how we can best do that. You may also open the link to the survey at any time from the resources window. You can use Facebook and Twitter widgets on the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag ACMLearning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a community discourse page to continue the discussion after the webcast, including questions we won't be able to get through during Q&A session. So today's presentation is Abuses and Misuses of AI, Prevention versus Reaction by Cristian Canton. Cristian Canton is a research manager on the AI integrity team at Facebook AI. He currently supports the AI Red team, which focuses on understanding weaknesses and vulnerabilities derived from the use or misuse of AI related to misinformation and election interference. Prior to this role, he was at Microsoft Research in Redmond and Cambridge, and before that, he was at Vicon, where he was bringing computer vision to produce visual effects for the cinema industry. Cristian earned his PhD and MS from the Technical University of Catalonia in Barcelona, and his MS thesis from EPFL Switzerland on computer vision topics. He's also an ACM member, which is really exciting, really exciting for me. Anyway, just for me, I guess. So I don't want to take up more of your time. So without further ado, Cristian, please take it away. Thank you so much for your patience, guys.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my my slides first before starting. So should be going now. So do you see me? Everything okay? Shall I start? Okay.
Go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. So as I mentioned, as Juan was mentioning, my name is Cristian Canton, and I am supporting the AI Red Team at Facebook. And I'm very pleased to be talking to you today on a topic that is pretty new. Actually, when I was invited to give a talk on what is an AI Red Team, I was pretty much like, it was a challenge for me because this is a very nascent topic. Everyone has heard about like adversarial machine learning, about like how AI could be weaponized, could be used against some platforms. And it's a very broad spectrum, and I would try to like to convey it in what we do at Facebook, but it's not just like that's a slice of what could be done on when trying to apply AI to the red teaming world. I'm gonna just like a small remark here because the topic is so broad, it's so complex. I'm gonna be trying to refer as much as possible to media manipulated because it's a topic that is very crucial for many interesting problems nowadays, especially like the US 2020 elections, but like a variety of problems like that might use manipulated media to spread like rumors, misinformation, etc. Not only the red team is going to be focused on some of the US 2020 topics, as Juan was mentioning, we can cover a broader area of problems that could be addressed. I'm going to like briefly mention a few of them. So without further dilation, I'm going to go into the outline. Again, like here's my name, and if you need like any question, also you can find me on Twitter. I mean, I'm more than happy like to comment and discuss on topics that you may have interesting. So I'm going to be covering a few aspects. I'm going to like do a brief introduction of what is a red team, because this is like many people have heard about what is a red team, but what does a red team do? What is the process, etc.? I think it's important like to get a clear understanding of that. Then I'm going to be touching on what are some of the abuses that could happen in AI, some of the misuses, which is also very interesting, and then like the other side, the flip of the coin, which is like what is the prevention? What can we do to prevent some of these abuses and misuses, and what is the reaction and mitigation strategies that you could keep in mind? All of this, like I'm going to try to illustrate with as many examples as possible. We were discussing before starting, like, hey, can you like explain some of the real weaknesses or vulnerabilities? Unfortunately, this is not something I can reveal, but I'm going to try to illustrate with as many interesting topics and examples as I can find. So let's start getting an introduction of what is the concept of a red team, especially for AI. So if we take a look at the current situation of AI, we will see that in the last, let's say, 5 years, 6 years, with the revolution of deep learning, there has been a huge advancement on the concept of adversarial attacks against AI. So there's a lot of interest on how we can use some techniques to make an AI do something that was not expected to do. Some attacks on how we can make an AI definitely be fooled. And this is something that started very anecdotically, 2014. I'd say like the first papers were in 2014 at CVPR. But as this graph shows you here, there's like a huge growth on the number of papers that feature some sort of attack or adversarial situation against AI. And this is interesting because at some point you have to be designing AI with keeping in mind that some of these attacks may happen. And you also have to keep in mind how to robustify your AI in order to be able to deflect some of these potential attacks. As we can see, this is a very exponential curve. It's growing very fast, and we see more and more examples. A good example was like CVPR very recently, ICML. There was a lot of papers that featured very, very ingenious ways of fooling AI. And this just yields immediately to the creation of a red team, which will try to understand what is the risk manifold, what is the risk that these potential adversarial attacks might create on potential systems that might be in production. I'm going to just touch very briefly on a small punctualization here. So an adversarial attack is not a gun. it could be a gun, but it's not. So it's a question that I get pretty often, like, oh, you're talking about guns. No, gun, it's a generative adversarial network. It's just a bunch of problems, solve a lot of like different computer vision and AI in general problems. An adversarial attack could be something completely different. Just to give you an example of what I understand as a clear example of what an adversarial attack is. For instance, I have this very classical example for Godfellow and his colleagues, where you have an image of a panda, and it's very well classified. Hey, this is a panda. You can add some adversarial noise, some imperceptible perturbations on the pixels that we cannot clearly see them here with our eyes because they're like so tiny, and it will fool the classifier to make think that this is a completely different thing. This is a gibbon, for instance. This is what I mean by an adversarial attack. When you're trying to say, and when I say calculated, it's very clear here. Like, we really wanted to make a mistake for this particular image or this particular class. So just setting the context. Now let me briefly touch on what is a red team. So a red team, if you just like take a look at what Wikipedia tells us, is a group of people that happens in organizations, and these organizations could be corporations, government, NGO, any organization that has a collection of people that take decisions, where this team is trying to improve themselves by providing an opposition, a thought that is the counterpoint to whatever decision is going to be taken. So in this way, you are creating this healthy discourse and trying to questioning everything that is going to be discussed in a way to improve and robustify your opinion, to make sure that you are thinking about all possible angles from all possible perspectives. That's a bit of the concept of the red team. Some people ask me sometimes, and why do you call it red team and not any other color? So that's some historical reason. In the war games that were happening in the 1800s in the Prussian army, they had like a board with all the pieces where like the friendly people, the friendly soldiers were blue, while the red pieces were the attackants. So it became like the red team. It comes from that time. But the concept of a red team goes even farther back in time, and this is interesting. So the first red team comes from the 16th century, and it was instaurated by the church, and it's called the Advocatus Diaboli, which means the devil's advocate. And that comes from the time where like a saint has to be proclaimed, and they appointed a few people just to check on all the good things and like miracles that this person achieved. And they appointed this devil's advocate that is going to try for every fact that proves the sanctity of a person that's attempting to become a saint. They're trying to find every possible counterfact to prove that this is wrong. And this is the very first instance where like the concept of a red team, it gets instaurated. And just for curiosity, this kind of iterative processes to setting a saint could take ages, and then the job of a devil's advocate was a very, very long and complicated one. So in history, there was always been like this concept of wargaming, trying to forecast what the enemy is doing. But what defines the real red teaming in the modern era has a very crucial point where it gets formalized very clearly. And it happened during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where Israel was attacked by Egypt in something that was a maneuver that was not expected. So everyone was expecting attack to happen from different parts. Nobody was expecting that the Egyptian army was going to cross the Red Sea. And it was not until they really attacked that Israel realized that they made a mistake, that they got very comfortable in the thinking that they were right, that this was impossible. And that causes the first crisis where they deliberately, in the army world, they create this 10-month discipline. And the 10-month discipline is one where one group intentionally appoints at least one person to serve as a loyal dissenter, someone that questions all the time the decisions and makes sure that we are not comfortable with human nature that prefers harmony when taking a decision. This has been like instaurated right now. This is a discipline that is pretty common in big corporations, and it has like a very well-defined protocol. So we're going to be applying it to AI, but this like has a way broader kind of application. I can recommend a couple of books that like really cover all these two books on red teaming that I'm citing here. But definitely, like, there's a lot of psychology, there's a lot of like protocol, there's a lot of formalism that follows a red teaming. And this is something that it came to me when I was like thinking a year ago when I started the red team at Facebook, the AI red team at Facebook, on what does it mean to have an AI red team in a company? What can we learn from this red teaming philosophy that is applied in a variety of domains into the AI space? I'm going to like touch very briefly also on trying to define what is the mentality and the mindset of an AI red team. Excuse me. So first of all, we try to bring the loyal adversarial mentality into the AI world, especially for systems in production. I'm going to be highlighting two things here. Loyal. So really we want to have a dissenter within the team that thinks adversarially, and we say loyal because sometimes the findings that you will encounter you cannot divulge. There might be like potential weaknesses that could be exploited. So that's this concept of keeping things in the inner circle. Don't distribute them till like you have them very well understood and well mitigated, or at least you know that they might not happen. So the other part that is very relevant is when I say like systems in production. And there's like a bunch of colleagues we discuss pretty often. Many of the papers that you will be reading in academia, they do not work in real life, in the sense that like you try to apply that to a complex system, like it could be Facebook, it could be like any other online system, it might not work. And that's for a simple reason. So usually when you post a picture or post a video in Facebook or any other platform, there's a number of steps, intermediate steps that happen from the moment you click till this thing gets published. In the case of images and videos, those might get recorded. They might be enhanced. Like, I don't know, a number of like operation may happen. That some of these adversarial attacks that are based on adversarial noise or imperceptible perturbations that you may add to a video or an image, those might be like washed away. So we have to be very clearly thinking on what does it mean an attack in a system in production. But because it's not just like taking a given algorithm and like apply it to some of pieces of information and pushing it out. It's something like you have to keep in the whole end-to-end understanding of the problem. And this is really important when you're trying to bring the AI red team mentality into a production system, to be able to bring insights that are actionable, insights that are real and probable, okay? Not just like the part of academia. Of course, academia, it's amazing. I mean, a lot of the ideas that might be applied come from academia, but we have to keep in mind that there's like some extra step that you have to consider. We need to understand also the risk landscape. That means that every company has a different risk landscape. For instance, you could imagine that there are areas where we can face adversaries more often than other areas. You could imagine like high stakes like US 2020, misinformation, selling of regulated goods, those, or people trying to monetize on aspects of selling like drugs or other stuff. You will be finding a lot of adversarial thinking. You'll be finding people very much motivated to break your system. So those are the areas where you may be facing like higher risk of adversarial attacks. Of course, there can be other areas where like the risk might be minor. Understanding where the battles will be fought, where like you can expect your enemy, and proactively trying to be a step ahead, it's very critical, especially for another reason that I'm mentioning in this next bullet. You will have a limited amount of resources. There's going to be like an infinite number of potential risks that can affect your company or your system or whatever you're trying to defend. You cannot tackle them. All of them. You cannot understand all of them. So it's a very critical mission on trying to identify, trying to evaluate and prioritize which are the most feasible areas or surfaces of risk. By doing that, you can place your resources and like prioritize what do you want to mitigate or understand first, okay? And that gets tied to what is the risk landscape of your company or whatever you're trying to apply a concept of an AI red team. So a red team, the whole end-to-end, it's hard to explain in the sense that we're not trying only to focus on abuses of AI, on how AI could be like misled to do something it was not expected. We're trying also to think about the misuses of AI, and this is something I'm going to be touching in the next slides, where like you're trying to see how a completely legit and innocuous piece of AI could be used to do something harmful, and how we can prevent on doing that. That's an enlargement of the of the idea of what the red team does. Usually red team tries to understand only risks derived from systems that might be in production. You can also try to see how AI could be weaponized or could be used like for nefarious purposes. And also trying to conceive what is the worst case scenario, okay? When you're building a red team, an AI red team, you have to build a group of experts. When I say group of experts, I'm not referring to just computer scientists and researchers. As I mentioned before, when you are analyzing a very complex system, you have to think of the end-to-end, and that end-to-end encompasses not only the research part, but infrastructure, how infrastructure plays a very critical role in potential AI attacks, how things may happen not directly on the piece that you're trying to protect, but somewhere else in the chain. So this is why you need like a team of multidisciplinary engineers and experts to help you cover the whole understanding, and not just to narrow or silo yourself in the part that you feel comfortable to analyze. Another part that is pretty critical is you have to define a strategy to convince your stakeholders of what is the potential impact and how you can mitigate and prevent that. One typical, big hurdle that every red team, AI or not AI red team, is going to find out is trying to convince people to invest resources to mitigate something that has never happened. You try to predict and say, like, if this happens, this is a potential worst case scenario. And there's a lot of ways to convince, like to have a diplomacy to make sure that understanding of what is this potential risk. And this is also a critical part of the success of a red team, just making sure that you get the buy-in of the people that can be potentially affected. And of course, adversarial AI changes every month. Every month you will have like a ton of papers like conceiving new potential attacks. This is why like the work of a red team is never over. You have to keep investing, keep understanding, be on the top of the state of the art, and repeat and periodically attack all the areas that you might have attacked in the past, because new attacks might come, and not repeating, like attempting to break a system that you probably have not broken in the past, it gives you like the false sense that you might be protected. So an AI red team is a kind of team where like the job is never over. You can never stop working. And finally, let's talk about defenses. Well, no, actually, we're not going to be talking about defenses, because defenses that are for the blue team. Usually like a red team can help. Definitely, we tell the story like, hey guys, we managed to break your AI system by doing this and this and this. We're trying like to partner with you, informing so that you can build better defenses. But it's in the nature of an AI red team not to be involved into defenses. You try to decouple the two worlds so that you can play your role as independent as possible, and with the same arguments and information that the attackers may have. Okay, that's a bit of like the summary of what a red team in AI tries to do. And I'm going to like refer to the before bullet, telling that it's an iterative and periodic interaction with stakeholders. You have to keep repeating that. And that's for a very, very well-defined reason. We have something called the Red Queen dynamics. And this comes from like this book from Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland. It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you have to run at least twice as fast. And if you try to translate that into scientific terms, it means that the rate at what attacks get created, conceived, and tested against like systems is usually way, way bigger than the rate that we can have at creating the defenses. So this is very important that a red team exists so that you can try to slow down the rate at what attacks happen by trying to understand them and informing the defense wall so that they can prioritize and make sure that they are putting the right defenses at the right places. But this is a never-ending story. You will always have more attacks than defenses. You have to think very, very strategically on how you can put the resources to mitigate that. And to conclude a bit on this introductory part, so every team that does any sort of red team has to have a concept of risk. How do we prioritize? How do we understand which things are more important than other things? In our case, we just borrow this equation that comes directly from the finance world and from the risk assessment world, which is like risk is usually severity times likelihood. For us, severity of AI might be many, many things. We could say like, hey, if this attack happens, our core metrics might get impacted. There might be some financial aspects. There might be some data leakage, PR fires. Human impact, of course. I mean, there's like many of these risks might have a direct impact into humans. what is the mitigation cost? What is the response time? So this is like confirms the severity of the problem. Getting more and more granularity on the different axes on how AI could incur in some severe impact into some of these aspects allows you to do a better job at understanding where you have to put your resources. In the same way, you have also the likelihood. How easy it is to discover these attacks? Some attacks are really easy to do, some are really easy to discover. Some attacks are really hard to discover. How easy is to implement or that attack or not? Usually, people are trying to like build an attack against a platform, any system. They were always trying to go with the cheapest way to do as much harm as possible. So you don't need like to go and think about like the really complicated, amazing attack that you just saw in the last conference. Probably is not going to happen. You should think of like the cheapest way that might bypass your systems that is really easy to do. We have to find that's your operational point. What is the motivation? Of course, like different risk surfaces will have different motivations. You have like people with financial incentives or political incentives or any other kind of incentives might add or more or less to this motivation. When you combine the two factors, you can get to an example of like this risk matrix, where you can have like a combination of severity and probability, and that will help you like prioritize and understand where do you have to put your resources to do the work. So that's a bit of an introduction of trying to explain a bit on what is the philosophy in a red team. And I wanted to go with a very first example that happened in Facebook. I'm able to talk about this because it has been mitigated. So it was like a couple of years ago, even before the AI red team was created, we did an exercise trying to understand what were potential vulnerabilities of our computer vision systems. And let's assume for a second that this image here is it's an objectionable content image. So of course, I didn't put any objectionable content. I mean, assume that this was nudity. And we find out at the time that by adding some lines on the top of the image, the classifier was confused and it was like not understanding what was happening there. So that was a good example where like we found the vulnerability, we communicated that, and it was mitigated. And sometime later, some nefarious actors tried to attack on this front, but luckily we had already like up to an extent accounted for that and prevented. So trying to think ahead of what bad actors might do might pay off and like might help have your system more robust. So that's again like probably the only example I can share about my day-to-day life. I'm going to move to the next section, which touches on abuses on AI. Just a second. So when we talk about abuses on AI, we are the concept we have in mind is how a system that is existing there will be like weaponized, will be like abused to do something that it was not intended to do. And here there's a very good example of a very recent paper, whereas the authors managed to like take a stop sign, add some paper stickers, like nothing really complicated, and the classifier that was detecting this as a stop sign like misclassified that as a maximum speed 60 miles per hour. So imagine that the system were to be running on an autonomous driver's car. So that could probably cause some damage, and that's a deliberate attack, and that's actually a real attack. I was mentioning before that some papers do not think of the end-to-end. Actually, this is a good example on how this was tested and proved that it could work in a real world. So the taxonomy on how attacks may happen is very varied. It's huge. I'm just going to try to cover with some examples on what does this risk taxonomy or this attacks taxonomy may look like. And this is a bit the process that we internally follow when trying to understand where the risk can be categorized. So for instance, we have like attacks may happen at 3 different levels: the targets, the techniques, and the knowledge. On targets, we have like the physical domain, and that could refer to the previous example where like we had a clear attack against like traffic signs. You're trying to directly change something into the very early stages of where the information is created. So that is the image or the physical entity, trying to manipulate it to make the system to make a mistake. Another example from a recent paper at ECCB is like this invisibility cloak from some colleagues at Facebook, where like they designed a T-shirt that will bypass like person detection systems and will not allow you to be detected. So that's a clear example where like you can like do some adversarial attack directly, not on the pixels, not on the system, but directly on the physical objects. Of course, we have like other attacks that may happen on digital representation, so the way that you store your data, or directly on the machine learning models if you have access to them, okay? Now we can just quickly touch on the techniques, and the techniques are very varied. Here's where we see like a lot of the real attacks that you might see in production or in academia come from this area here. One very first one is on the data access, and this is like one of the most interesting ones personally. I like that. Is like if you know exactly how the data has been used to train an algorithm, you can try to abuse that. And that goes into understanding the biases of classifiers. And that's a very clear example from another paper from my colleagues at FAIR in New York, where, okay, this is the distribution of the world. And if we take a look at the distribution of where the images used into the very classical and very prevalent ImageNet dataset that has been used to train a lot or to pre-train a lot of the computer vision models existing in the world, we see that like the distribution of the data comes from a very determined part of the world. It doesn't cover the whole world. It covers mostly North America, Europe, and some parts of Asia and Australia. So if you are trying to like take the ImageNet data to train a classifier, what you may encounter is that the accuracy for classifying images that come from determined regions of the world will be higher in places where the distribution comes, I mean, the data distribution matches the geography, while other areas you might be incurring in some biases here. So take in mind that imagine you are building a classifier to, I don't know, defend some system for whatever purposes, and you are not paying attention to the distribution of your data. So then you might be like hurting some subpopulations. Imagine that you are training a classifier with data biased to a specific demographics or a specific gender, ethnicity, or skin tone. What may happen is that these biases could be weaponized, could be used against you because like you did not do a good job at balancing and keeping in mind that this AI has to serve a world that is plural and very diverse. So that's a way where like the data biases could be used as an attack, and that's how like if you have access to the training data, this is a potential problem. Another good example, it's data poisoning, and I like this one particularly. So if you can modify some of your training data in a very deliberate and very like well-engineered way, we can make your system to have a backdoor that for a specific class or a specific type of images, it will make a deliberate mistake. This is the example here. It's an attack with 1 pixel changes, where the authors took like 1 pixel and just like slightly changed the color. And I don't know if you can see it here. Like there's a pixel a little bit greenish than others. So for every class that contains an airplane, what happens effectively is that your AI will overfit. Whenever there's this pixel, it will predict the given class. So then effectively at inference time, you can force the system to predict this is an airplane by just changing 1 pixel. These poison attacks are very dangerous, but also require internal access to your systems. And of course, like we have other examples, attacks and techniques into testing that I will not cover here, but definitely like if you have time, take a look at them. And again, this is a huge tree. I just trimmed it a bit down, and they have like thousands of papers for each of the bullets. I just wanted to give you a sense of like how big and how diverse is this like attack manifold. Finally, we have the typical taxonomy on what is the amount of knowledge that you have out of your system. So we have like black box systems, which is most of the system you have in production. We have gray box systems. We have like some understanding of what's happening, what is the model architecture, what was initialization. Any small piece of information might help you like try to understand how the model operates, and you can try to attack on that. And the worst case, that is a white box attack. We have full access to the model, when that implies that you can do effectively anything. And usually these kind of attacks come from inside the company. Some of the interesting ones on black box that are pretty relevant that I find also very interesting are how you can do model extraction, how you can take a black box and you can like design systems to query and get like extract the whole network out of it, which are like very dangerous. And these are like some of the areas where we see a lot of papers right now coming out. And again, it's a very interesting area where it covers cryptography concepts with AI, and we are definitely like interested into them. That's a bit of like idea of how systems could be abused. And okay, and again, like there's a lot of work trying to prevent. There's like a parallel graph to this one where you have the defenses, and I definitely like encourage you to take a look at the Tabassi et al. Paper that is cited here when it mentions all the defenses. As I mentioned, like the red team usually are not so much in both, so I'll let you guys take the time to take a look at that. Now I'm going to spend some time on the misuses, and I'm going to have like two very clear examples. So usually this is a less common area for an AI red team to focus. Usually you focus on, as I mentioned before, the abuses and how things might go wrong. In my team, we were trying to think more is like how existing technologies could be used to do some nefarious purposes. And I'm going to be using two examples here, which have been like in the news in the past, so like I'm sure you will be familiar with. So one clear example is the case of synthetic people. You have seen like in the last 5 years an amazing progress in generative adversarial networks that allow us to generate images that are so realistic that are really, really, really hard to distinguish from real life. A good example is the StyleGuide paper, which is an amazing piece of technology, which is able to generate these faces of people that do not exist. I mean, these people do not exist in real life. They have been generated by an AI system. And there's like just like citing this the block diagram here because I think this is pretty interesting, where you take a random vector, a latent space, which is random, and you map it to another space, this W space, that has semantic understanding, that disentangles the random parts that you have in the latent space, and you bring it to a space where every factor has like a very specific purpose into the generation of the face. And the beauty of this paper for me is how you progressively go from a low resolution to a high resolution image by progressively increasing the resolution with the synthesis network. And this yields to these very impressive images here. Of course, you could say like, hey, this is amazing. It has a lot of good potential applications, and there's like plenty of those that you can search. And some of them are like creative purposes. You can create your own avatar, virtual characters, or another like very recent one, that's semantic face editing. You can try like, hey, change your smile, change your, I don't know, your hairstyle, etc. One of the good points of this technology so far is that even if it's really good, if it's almost perfect, it's really hard to, at the naked eye, tell if like there's something not real from this person, is that, of course, there's still some artifacts. Some like artifacts like, I don't know, specularities in the background, or some face inconsistencies when the pose is not like perfectly frontal, which allows us to understand sometimes, to get the gist that this person may not exist. If you like take a look at the Fourier domain, you will see that, of course, there's a lot of traces. There's a lot of like artifacts derived from this generation process that are baked into the pixels. And this is how like for synthetic people and for other like types of synthetic media like deepfakes that I'm going to be touching in a minute, you can still build systems that can distinguish between real and fake or real and synthetic by looking at some of these traces. So that gives us a full sense of safety that like this problem is solved. But as we mentioned, this is not a adversarial game. We are expecting that generators are going to get better and better, and eventually these artifacts will, be no longer there. So we have to keep innovating and keep finding ways to generate and find ways to detect this potential adversarial information here. Let me touch on a clear case. Let me introduce Andrew Waltz, Katie Jones, and Matilda Romero, which these people do not exist. These people are real profile pictures from fake social media users. So those like cases where in multiple, social networks have been used to create and impersonate people that do not exist, and then you have like fake profiles. It's like a misuse of AI that we're trying to prevent here, trying to understand how synthetic media could be used for nefarious purposes. Of course, some of them could be like pranks or jokes, but some others may have nefarious intent. I like to start like a next iteration, like, okay, you could say, I'm putting this here, and I know that some systems will be able to catch on the classifier, on the generator, and tell me that this is a fake profile. But I'm just citing a recent paper that was presented at CPR. You could also add some adversarial noise, as we did before with the panda, to the picture of this synthetic person. And if we know exactly what kind of algorithm is out there to detect and classify if something is fake or not, you can target that classifier and make it make a deliberate mistake. So again, like there's always an iterative process where like bad actors will try to keep improving, and that's a very good example, meaning that the battle is never ending. And again, this is a real case. Another area of interest where like images or videos can be, or technology could be, is deepfakes. Everyone is very much aware of what deepfakes is, and deepfakes in particular try to like do a pairwise swap on faces between two people. This has a lot of creative purposes. It could be used for a million applications in the cinema industry, in the creative industry, for a lot of different kind of applications. But unfortunately, this could be also used to do harm. You can see a lot of people trying to think that, hey, deepfakes may have an impact on misinformation, or in the elections, or for bullying, for many, many things. So this is why this is an aspect that we should keep in mind very, very closely. Let me touch on, okay, we have like some abuses and some misuses, and we want to be thinking on how do we do prevention of those. I'm going to refer again into the deepfakes space. One way that you can do that is ask the experts. So try to understand how these things could be weaponized, how these things could be detected. And one example is like the deepfake detection challenge that my team put together within Facebook. And we had a competition at Kaggle where we were giving away $1 million to whoever was able to create the best deepfake detector. And when we're trying to understand how you can build a good detector, you have to be probing and try to be creating data that is as representative as possible of how things might go wrong, how bad actors might be trying to fool you. For this case in particular, we constructed a very large data set, and we're trying to think of every possible way where like a deepfake could be created. We took, I don't know, it's expressed in the paper, I would say like, I don't know, 10, 15 methods to generate deepfakes. Some of them are pretty obvious, some of them very sophisticated, but trying to understand what is the whole spectrum of generation, trying to see if people can come up with ways to detect these nefarious deepfakes that might be posted. It's not only that we have to explore all the possible ways to generate deepfakes. In our case, for instance, we pay a lot of attention on ethnicity. You want to be taking on gender, on age. You're trying to build like a data set that is as inclusive as possible, trying to explore very fairly what is the distribution that this could be affected to, and trying to do a good job both for like a person of gender A or age B or ethnicity C against like any other type of ethnicity, gender, or age. So trying to cover the whole spectrum. Of course, like another thing that is very interesting is how your adversaries are going to be trying to deceive you by simpler ways. We mentioned that we're always trying to find the cheapest way to fool you, to fool your AI. And in some cases, like you have like to explore all sorts of potential adversarial perturbations. Here you have like, hey, of course, the typical changes on color, on contrast, on noise, but even things like let's apply some of these creative filters with like cat ears or I don't know, some funny like logos or anything. These are areas where your potential adversaries will try to exploit because those are cheap to generate and those can be very effective. And just to keep touching on how do you make sure that you understand the risk manifold, how things might go wrong, I'm going to be touching on something that's pretty critical, which is the domain gap and distribution shift. So in this engraving from the 18th century, you have this person which is like, there's the universe as he knows it, and that's the rest of the universe, and this person is trying to find the truth. And this is pretty much what we're trying to do here. So no matter how hard you try to design and test your algorithms, your test distribution is always going to be confined. It's never going to be representative of everything that can be out there in the universe. Nonetheless, your goal is still to go through that and try to be as realistic as possible and to stress test your systems as much as you can. Again, like one good example came from this deepfake competition, where we had like people doing amazing job into the testing, in the test part, or the validation part of the competition. But when trying to apply the same algorithm into the real deepfakes, the one that you can find posted all over the internet, there was a decrease in performance. You could see that, like, for instance, some of the log losses you have here reported, some people were doing amazing on data coming from the same distribution as training, but when trying to apply that to the real deepfakes, that was not that good. So there was a huge domain gap here. So still, you have to think that no matter how well you design through testing, there's always room for improvement. Things are going to be different when you are trying those in real life. And you have to be very conscious of that. Otherwise, you might be fooling yourself, and here's where risk starts to creep in. Just to give you an example with some curves that we have here. These are like the ROC curves and precision recall for the algorithms that were submitted, the top winner algorithms, on the data that was from the same distribution of the trained data, the testing data. And of course, the curves look beautiful. However, when you're trying to apply the same algorithm into real deepfakes that we might have sourced from the internet, well, the curves are fairly different. So the problem is not so solved. There's a lot of work to be done there. And trying to do this exercise is critical not to fool yourself. Here's another interesting thing. If you start like applying these easy transformations that tries to throw away your classifier by adding some noise, by like changing the frame rate, by doing some quantization, you will see that there's a degradation on the performance. And for instance, like here, if you apply a flower filter to your video, where like essentially a crown, and you add some salt and noise, paper noise, the classifier will make a huge mistake, will not be doing the right thing. And understanding that was also critical. Another thing that is very important is understanding your metrics. So when people we're trying to understand how well is your algorithm doing, you will probably plot precision and recall curves, and here's the end of the story. When you're trying to thinking on how real AI systems run in production, you have to think of metrics that account for the imbalance. Usually, like 99% of the things that you might see in social media or the internet are going to be benign, innocuous. There's no nefarious intent in them. However, like the distribution might be like for every one, for instance, deepfake, which is posted into social media, you may have like 100 million of images that are completely benign. So in this case, for instance, we plot the precision and the weighted precision, where we are embedding this alpha factor here, where we're waiting for one true positive, how many false positives can I be injecting? And if we take a look at that graph, then things look pretty scary, because you have not to optimize just for a 50-50 distribution. You have to optimize for a distribution where you have like 1 to 100 million, for example, 1 to 1,000 or 10,000, like in this graph. And then you have to start thinking about how many false positives my system can allow. And this changes very much the way you start designing systems when you keep a mindset of how risk is handled. Another thing that you can do to do some prevention is run riskathon. So riskathon is very much part of an AI red team. In particular, we run one every week, internal, and we're trying to bring people to think out of the box in their own domain. So even if the team has 10 engineers, out of there's going to be like hundreds of thousands of ingenious people that we're trying to defeat you. So having a forum where you can have people to think adversarially and allow them to think how things might go wrong in the domain could inspire a red team, because the red team cannot think of everything. So it has to have a lot of close partners with a lot of people. For the riskathon, for the deepfake competition in particular, we had the riskathon. We invited all of our academic partners, and they tried to break the winning models, and they found very interesting insight. Like if you're trying to do adversarial noise, like noises like the one we applied to the panda, you can break the classifiers. Some people with face kind of particular skin conditions, vitiligo, burns, or even babies, they have faces that are very smooth or have some artifacts. Those might be misclassified. Understanding this, it's important, because you might be creating a risk for subpopulations, and you really don't want to do that. Makeup, scarves, these people prove that you have to think out of the box to make sure that you are understanding how things could go wrong. Another interesting concept that happened during this competition is do we want to do open sourcing or closed sourcing of solutions? And the pros of closed sourcing is that it's good as you can keep the secret and not tell to everyone. But the cons is that if this gets leaked and you don't know, you might be underestimating what the enemy knows. And then you can be like fooling yourself into thinking that you will not ever be attacked. One good example is the deepfake detectors that are out there, like ExceptionNet and Mesonet. The fact that they are out there, it makes a challenge, because we have a paper from Nekara et al. Here where like they took those models and just like fool them, create a tailored adversarial noise to try to throw them off if they are ever put in production. So that means that it's not that we don't have to open source. I'm personally like a strong supporting of open source software. Is that you have to think out of the box. What else can you do so that even if the technology is open source, your systems are still reliable? And I'm going to be closing with reaction. We say like prevention. We can think out of the box, try to like find the worst case scenario. What will we do when we have to react? Because we have to be honest with ourselves. Not all the potential risks that you may identify will be mitigated, because it's like a finite amount of resources that you can have so that you can use to mitigate. When mitigating, of course, we have to be preventive, but this is not possible for every potential risk. We have to define mitigations for almost or all the risky potential scenarios. And that doesn't mean to build a system to fix that. It could be as easy as having a playbook. Or what is the war room strategy in case of this happens? Could be like a cheaper way to mitigate once the harm is done. It may never happen. So like, but thinking ahead of time, like if this happens, what can I do to fix that? It's a critical path to success. Of course, like if you can pre-mitigate, it's awesome. But if not, like think proactively on how you can fix things. Another like amazing way to do or trying to mitigate is build defensive systems in mind so that they can rapidly incorporate new adversarial samples, even if there's very few of them. So imagine that you start to see like some types of new deepfakes start to emerge. Can we build a system that will incorporate them? For instance, I have like a good paper at CAPR this year that does that. So that's a good way of thinking on risk prevention. And end of the day, like risk will happen everywhere. Risk will happen in my platform, it happen in your platform. So thinking ahead and defining coordination strategies, if possible, that may allow to mitigate these potential AI-centric attacks across multiple surfaces or entities. Personally, I think this is the right thing to do. It's complicated, of course, but if possible, this is always a good path. Coordination, it's always a good thing against nefarious actors. So just to conclude, so of course, like always assume an adversarial mindset when developing systems on the top of AI. Things have changed. AI has come to an age where like attacks may happen more and more because this is a system very prevalent. Almost every industry in the world is using AI for something. We cannot like be blind to that. We have to think how things can go wrong. That means that you have to understand the risk manifold. You have to quantify it and make informed decisions on where do you want to put your preventions, when do you want to put your strategy to make these informed decisions. Again, like as I mentioned, the AI red teaming scope and focus can be very broad. I will cover some of the areas here, but the scope is way bigger. If you go ask other AI red teams that might be in other corporations, they might have a different charter, which is it's very interesting. Stress test merciless, like never assume that your system is good, that your system is perfect. Bring a strategy to convince your stakeholders that what is the worst case scenario in AI and how you can mitigate that. And just like I like to conclude with the motto of many red teams, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle. And for AI, this is very critical. Moving forward, we're an AI-centric world. This is extremely important. And I hope that I convinced you just a little bit to be thinking along these lines. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sure there's some questions I'm more than happy to answer. If there's no time, more than happy to follow up on Twitter if you want to engage talking with me. So with that, I'm going to close sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Cristian. That was a really great talk, and we really appreciate you for giving it, as well as I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions about it as well. I've been kind of fielding them, as I've said. So before we continue with the Q&A, just wanted to mention there were some questions about how to pick up and learn about GAN, the Deepfake Detection Challenge, and I just wanted to mention that we do have supplementary materials available on the discourse page. for this particular ACM Tech Talk. So we'd also recommend checking out those resources as well. So we're going to get started with some Q&A. And I think the first question I had was just to make some distinctions about some practices that are being done in computing relative to the practices that the AI red team at Facebook does, or in general, the perspective of what a red team should do. So I guess the first question is there an overlap in terms of what the red team does with risk management practices related to AI, or is it and security penetration testing? And is there a way to compare and contrast the two?
That's a great question. So in any big corporations, and particularly Facebook, have like a number of red teams. There's the AI red team, there's the security red team, which is more on penetration testing or motion. There's like the physical security red team. There's like a bunch of happening in many ways. Having a common language on risk is very important. And this is something that we are working, actually, that you nail it. This is something we're trying to understand now, how we can start talking the same language across risk, because it's more important a risk on AI or a risk on physical security. I don't know how to compare that. Like, I think there's still like some work to be done into homogenizing the vocabulary, the nomenclature, and the measurement of risk across heterogeneous kind of risk surfaces. But this is a great question, and definitely, like, I think there's a lot to be done on understanding and quantifying risk.
Great. No, that totally makes sense. I guess a follow-up question to that would be kind of like some people were asking questions about the operational dynamics between what the red team does and what the blue team does. And I was curious whether you would have the time to kind of delineate or compare the two.
Sure. I mean, usually you have a blue team at Facebook, of course, that's my counterparts. And we try to be as independent as possible. So like we will try to attack them. And when we attack them and we manage to break their defenses, the first thing we do is like, hey guys, we managed to break you. This is how we did that. I'm not interested in how are you going to mitigate this, because that is going to inform me. It's like two black boxes trying to attack each other. So whenever they fixed our attack, we'll try again. And it's going to take us harder and harder. Usually the virtuous circle of the red and blue team dynamics is it's harder and harder for a red team to break down whatever defenses the blue team put there. At some point, it's so hard that maybe the battle is over. Maybe we don't need to keep attacking for a while till we get like a better repertoire of attacks in our back. So it's a good, I don't know, fight, but it's always like trying to keep as isolated as possible to mimic what is happening out there, because the adversaries will try to break your system, will not come and tell you. So we're trying like to keep as close to that paradigm as possible.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Actually, that brings up a good segue for one of the other questions, which is kind of comparing what we need to do in terms of security paradigms relative to software paradigms. So just for context, when you deal with security, right, there's two type of paradigms you could deal with. One is the rigorous security certification that's necessary, that takes a longer process, versus patching, which is a lot quicker in terms of like being able to deal with problems. Both have obviously their pros and cons. When you look at software software development paradigms, we have somewhat of a similar parallel, where we have the waterfall model, where you go through a different types of process, requirements, specifications, and design, as opposed to the agile like model, right? In terms of like just being able to build a prototype and seeing where the failures are going to happen, and then trying to deal with it quickly and building requirements and specifications around it. And so I guess the question here would be kind of how do you deal with that sort of tension, where you do need to build something in the long term that is secure, but also you need to deal with the fact that there's some things you just need to patch and deal with really quickly.
Exactly what you say here. Like there's some projects that are long-term, trying to build ways to detect and assess these vulnerabilities in a recurring way. Some other things like happen, entropies in the world, and like as I mentioned before, this attack, the rhythm at what attacks get generated, it's very fast. New things may emerge every day. You might not be able to bake that into like the long-term strategy to continuously assess the security of your system, or you might, but it's going to take longer. So, of course, patches have to come in, like the example I put with these tribes. If this happens, we have to everyone jumping, trying to fix that. But trying to keep a good sense of how things are changing, at what pace, it's really important, and especially for AI, because this is like a way less immature field as the one of software engineering. We have like, I don't know, 50 years of like iterating and debugging processes to catch more and more, because we are still like building up. This AI adversarial world is moving so fast. Yes, we can try to like learn and borrow some of this concept from software engineering, but I'm pretty much sure we'll have to develop new paradigms for the future, given the rapid motion that we're seeing attacks happening. Again, like in my team in particular, we're trying to borrow as much as possible and try to mimic this kind of a process. Yet I think there's like way more to do. And again, I encourage everyone to keep thinking about that, because those are the right questions to ask.
No, that's a very fair point. I kind of want to switch gears a little bit from that, but we will return to some of those questions. There was a really interesting question regarding to the Yom Kippur War, which obviously started in October 1973. So that's been decades in the past. I think one of the things that this question brought up was that political military gaming or simulations have existed before, where you deal with trying to figure out how to deal with deliberate adversarial teams. And so I think the question that's being asked is, what is the distinction from that sort of environment, obviously other than the context itself, right? So
I think the context is not so different. Like, I mean, in that context of the Yom Kippur War, and again, I'm not a politician or an expert on like military or political relations. There were a bunch of factors, and there were people were overconfident that some things may not happen given the intelligence that they had. They never had anyone in the room saying like, hey, this is very unlikely, but this may happen. What if this happens? That was completely ignored, and it was not until like the war was quite advanced that they realized that they were overconfident there. In AI, for Red Team for AI, you might be facing the same things. You might be facing stakeholders that were like, hey, this is never going to happen. Even if you think it's going to happen, like my hunch is that this will not happen. That's where like building a very robust and very concentrated way of delivering and getting the buy-in from your stakeholders is critical. Because you might find people like, I'm not going to put like 10 engineers to fix something. I personally think it's not feasible. That's where like proving with simulations, with worst case scenarios, like, hey, if this happens, we cannot do anything, or we can do this or that. It's really important. And I think we learned that from like the real world kind of scenarios for red teaming, where like the more data you have to support the validity of your assumptions and the chances of this happening, the easier it might be to get buy-in, and the easier it might be like to do something to the respect. But again, like there's a lot of parallels. I think some of them, or most of them, are shared, but I think there's more to do. And again, like if anyone is interested, definitely the two books I recommended before, it's a great lecture. I mean, like you can borrow a lot of examples, and you will see that many of my words are borrowed from them and not just like building them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for the recommendations in the books. I think we'll do our best to have that in the supplementary materials as well. So I think there's a question here asking about kind of the type of diversity of attacks that you deal with. So a lot of the examples that have been shown have been based on pattern recognition, but there's questions about can you talk a little bit more about how to deal with natural language processing and the dangers that come with that?
I touch mostly on computer vision topics because, again, like it's easier to visualize in slides, and this is like some of the more prevalent or more potential attacks that we've seen at Facebook. Of course, NLP, speech, all these are surfaces of risk. You could imagine in NLP, there's many ways where you can, start like shuffling characters or like having like there's a lot of attacks where like you can mask your message and make the potential models are trying to pick up if this is, I don't know, slurs or like this is objectionable kind of like a speeching, it's in there. Of course, those happen, and those are part also of the chart of my team. Also, those are sometimes easier to generate because it's text. Like sometimes it has like some easier components. But again, like yes, this happened. I cannot comment much on those. Those are amazing. There's like some with this revolution of bird classifiers or very large language models. This opens a huge, immense area of risk, which is pretty interesting. Like I'm sure, like many of you have seen like this GPT-3 generation of text that looks almost indistinguishable from like humans, and how like are the potential ramifications of this. Yeah, NLP is an area, speech, video, images. everywhere there's potential risk, you have to think very holistically about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess we're almost running out of time, so I have two more questions left, actually. So going off of that point, I think when we talk about a lot about information security, there's three things you could potentially do with data, right? You can run into confidentiality attacks where you could steal a copy of the data. You can deal with integrity attacks, where you can modify the data, or you can deal with availability threats, which is like when someone deletes data. And all of those, obviously, I think the red team has to deal with within their mandated teams. So I think the question I had there was more about where are you seeing a lot more issues with when you're dealing with security threats, or trying to prevent security threats, I guess.
Okay, like you touch on a few things here. Usually, I would say like insider threats. Usually, this is not something that my team monitors. We kind of says like the risk of something being leaked or not. I think most of like the surface attacks in social media is the kind of black box attacks where people try to probe your systems till they find something that is broken, and try like to iterate and I don't know, break more your system, gaining access to deeper kind of like the data that has been used, or the model architecture, or the weight of the network. Those are, those are not impossible. Nothing is impossible. But probably overcomplicated. And in my tenure, this is not something that I have dealt much with.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, I was just curious too, because like I think Gene Spafford was like, you could throw like a security system into a box and like have it with armed guards, but it still wouldn't be that secure. But yeah.
Definitely, there's like different levels of security. Like you have like things running on an enclave, you can have running on the edge. Of course, it's more risky if you have like something running on a device that you can try to disassemble. But this is part of the risk assessment. How risky is to like deploy a model? How risky is like to run it on your backend? All these are considerations that are thoroughly assessed before doing any launch of anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, one final question. So bear with me here. Yeah, and again, thanks for everyone for staying. We really appreciate it. So there's a lot of people who are interested in what you're doing and the type of work a red team mentality entails, as well as professors who are interested in kind of teaching it. So this is actually a twofold question. One is, what are the best resources you would recommend to teach AI red teaming in a university? And how do you as a student, or someone as a student, build experience to be able to work in that sort of environment?
I have to say that up to my expertise, like there's no like a canonical book that I could refer on AI red teaming. I know there's like some of my colleagues in this space are working on some initial thoughts about this. I don't think there's like a centralized resource for that. And again, like I would say like my recommendation for teachers could be like learn about what red team is and try to like apply to the AI world. And I think there's still a lot of work into standardizing what does it mean exactly, because some of the red teams of my colleagues in other corporations, they approach it in a very different way, and it's complementary to the way I see the red teaming moving forward. For students, I would say there's like a huge amount just by looking into the papers being published. Those are extremely inspiring. Even if I mention like some of them might not work in real life because you are not considering the complexity of the end-to-end system, but yet, those are very inspiring. There's a lot of like really amazing people talking all the day about this in the DEF CON kind of circles, into the Twitter community. There's like a bunch of people that have a lot of interesting conversations on real AI red teaming aspects. I would say like this is the most lively and up-to-date source of information that I would recommend people interested in the topic to follow. But I don't think there's like a follow ABC and you will get an expert. It's more like learn by doing and by like talking to others and forming your own opinions on that.
Makes sense. That's a very practical information. Sounds like my professor basically told me the same thing. Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay,
no, that's
cool. Well, okay, great. Always an awkward conversation ender with me. But yeah, I'm afraid we've kind of run out of time. We went a little bit overboard because we were trying to answer as much questions as possible. But first, I'd like to thank so much Cristian for your very informative presentation and really robust answers for our Q&A. again, very much appreciated. I also wanted to thank people for staying on board and being part of the conversation. We very much appreciate it here. Just to mention again, this talk has been recorded and will be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org. You can also find more announcements on our upcoming talks and other ACM activities on that website as well. Again, that's learning.acm.org. For more information on the ACM and a lot of our other activities, we highly recommend you check out acm.org. We have a whole slate of information there. Finally, we really appreciate it if you would take time to fill out our survey where you can suggest future topics or speakers, if we want to follow up, that sort of thing. And you should be able to see that on your screen. So on behalf of the ACM, Cristian Canton and myself, Juan De Hoya, I really want to say again, thank you so much for being part of this journey, and I hope you will join us again in the future for more of our ACM Tech Talks. So that concludes our talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.